Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The United States has added 8 Chinese companies, including the world's largest commercial drone maker, to an investment blacklist this week. The U.S. Department of Treasury pointed to these companies' so-called involvement in the surveillance of Chinese ethnic minorities, which is groundless accusation. There are already around 60 Chinese firms on the list. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said on Wednesday China opposes the U.S. moves that overstretch national security and the unreasonable suppression of Chinese companies. How could this growing number of Chinese companies in the U.S. blacklist weigh on the uneasy global recovery amid a resurgent pandemic? Let's ask our panelists. For the latest on the tech competition, quote unquote, in New York, Anthony Chen, former JP Morgan Chase chief economist; in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, dean from the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics in China. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. It is very important for all of us to understand the impacts of these sanctions and the latest policies. So, Professor Liu, how do you see the facts that there have been quite a number of times of Chinese companies being listed on the so-called entity list in the U.S.? What does that mean for these companies?
The impact on the companies is really significant because right now they are really under a crossfire because one is that the Department of Commerce has already fired a number of frauds, over 60 and plus companies, and on the restriction of trade between the Chinese firms and the U.S. firms, and now the Treasury Department is also, acting very aggressively against the Chinese companies on the investment participation by the U.S. Firms. So this means that the decoupling efforts is still moving forward in the same trajectory as the Trump administration.
I see.
So therefore, now the predicament is that while the U.S. under Joe Biden administration is promoting collaboration, particularly on climate change issues, and these high-tech companies actually are working towards the contribution of climate change, and particularly now how this predicament can be resolved. And this does not only mean the impact and implication on Chinese companies, but the U.S. companies as well as the overall global issue of addressing climate change and economic recovery to the world.
Mr. Chen, of course, go to you. You are not representing the U.S. government, that's for sure. But for the businesses, what does that mean? Because once being listed on the so-called entity list and also the other lists by the United States government, American companies could hardly interact and have technology exchanges and exports to these companies. That could also mean some kind of loss for American businesses as well.
My hope and expectation was that somehow both countries would come to an agreement as to which data was necessary to satisfy regulators both in the United States and in China. That, of course, is not happening, but it's a big disappointment because when you're looking at the 2 largest countries, you really need to promote cooperation. And it goes beyond climate change. Climate change is important, but here it's a question of whether we will be able to promote in a favorable fashion the economies of both China and the United States. And it is a dark day when we move in the other direction.
Mr. Chen, just to follow up, there's already talk about so-called businesses have to close the so-called digital door for security. Now, that to me is a very sensitive way of putting things because once you close the door, a lot of things becoming even more challenging and difficult for all parties. So, Mr. Chen, how much leeway and how much strength American businesses, generally speaking, could have at this moment in negotiating out their way or their space at least?
People that participate in trade. And what I hear from them is that they are definitely talking behind the scenes and letting Washington know the importance of keeping a dialogue and keeping cooperation alive. Obviously, it's been a challenge, and obviously it's an ongoing process, and so far it does not look like it's going in the right direction. But I always maintain some positive hope that at the last hour, cooler heads will prevail, and they will move in the direction of realizing that there's much to lose by not cooperating and not promoting trade between China and the United States. And hopefully the heated rhetoric that everybody is reading about in the press will in fact start to die down.
Professor Liu, we see some Chinese businesses, companies particularly, once there were media reports about them likely to be on certain kind of list by the U.S. government. Recently, they would scrap off their IPOs in Hong Kong or elsewhere. For these companies, how do you see they are trying to create their space despite of the latest difficulties?
Well, businesses always have different logic as to those politicians, particularly now. If you see that the new entity list by the Treasury is based on humanity issues or the Xinjiang issues. So this is really...
you say humanity issue or human rights issue, quote unquote?
Yeah, human rights issue and also humanity issue, what they consider as,
China, of course, has been denying about those accusations.
Of course. So that's exactly, one is that, is it factual? Two, is it logical? Three, is it really effective? So, without these three questions being answered and taking such a bold and aggressive action, that's already a big problem. And businesses will have to respond, in a legal fashion, and what is their legitimate rights. And then, businesses will also create some of the political ramifications by working together and see that what is really the key importance today by working together towards the endless frontier of technological innovation, and also to bring up the world economy by working together with the two biggest economies. So this is really something that businesses really should fight for their own rights.
How do you see they're fighting? I mean, Shangtang Technologies, for example, there were news before they were listed in IPO in Hong Kong that they're likely to be listed in somewhere, some kind of list by the American government, according to some media reports, and then they immediately scrap off their attempt to be listed in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. How do you see reactions like these from businesses being caught in the crossfire of politics and geopolitics?
I think that's a very good question, but a very difficult question to answer, because the individual companies will have to make a sensible decision within the micro level, for their stakeholders and the key investors. So therefore, they may have made a sensible, so they may sense the right time to make the decision to comply, or at least to reinvent their portfolios in order to satisfy the requirement. But, on a macro level, because we do see that there's going to be a whole dozen of other entity lists that's going to be produced against Chinese companies if these companies do not really team up together, and that's going to be a domino effect and over the entire Chinese business community working together with the U.S. companies and business community at large. So therefore, I think it is really sensible and timingly important for companies to work out some sort of a strategy on a macro level.
If I could just more on this front, you were earlier talking about how would they use law to protect themselves. I understand that earlier this year in China, there's a law called Antiforeign sanction law. in an effort to react to foreign sanctions that China or Chinese businesses do not consider as reasonable. Now, Professor Liu, how is that law being used at this moment by business community in China whose interest that they consider has been harmed by foreign sanctions, including sanctions from the United States?
Well, I think this law is really on the government level for retaliation. But for businesses to apply to such a law, they may not really bring immediate benefit to themselves. So what I mean is that they use the U.S. law, for example, ByteDance and Luoquan have really succeeded. And previously, Treasury also succeeded in revoking some of the sanctions that is pending on them. Of course, Chinese government should support by shoring up the friendly environment for companies to move forward, both in finance and trade. But resorting to the U.S. law is a more of immediate choice.
You know, we see some interesting phenomena earlier, at least, that the American businesses try to take advantage of some kinds of politics within their reach to influence policies that China might have toward U.S. businesses. However, over the past few months, it seems that some businesses have realized things are getting really out of control, and the geopolitics are playing a much upper hand than the real interests of businesses. So there have been a lot of rethinking about the approaches the business could have toward the U.S. government and working with the U.S. government as well. So, Mr. Chan, from the legal perspective, how American businesses, with their markets and with their visions in different parts of the world, including in China, could take advantage of the legal means and tools?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I've been in Wall Street for over 35 years. And what I've seen is that this has been a real long journey. And what you see lately, and I agree with a lot of what Professor Liu has said, but what you're seeing lately is that companies in the United States and probably even in China are realizing that even though lobbying has been somewhat successful in the past, it appears that now the power of governments, both the Chinese government and the US government, is becoming much stronger. And so the lobbying impacts these days is much less. So the solution to a lot of the problems that we are discussing today is that we need both the US government and the Chinese government to sit down and discuss these things and come to some sort of an agreement. If we are to rely on the lobbying efforts of both US companies and Chinese companies to resolve this without the support of the government, we're not going to make progress. Let's hope that both governments sit down and iron these issues once and for all so that we can make progress. Otherwise, we will not.
Mr. Chen, follow up on that. Recently, we have seen the first virtual meeting between the two presidents, the Chinese and American president. And many praise that as at least an occasion to compare notes and be able to share different opinions. Do you see the lists thing would become a more regular practice despite political efforts at the very top level?
What I see from these kinds of talks is that there are many issues out there, and these lists are important, but if you listen and you follow the discussions between both countries in the virtual meetings, you realize that these entity lists are important, but they're not the top priority, that there are many other top issues between both countries that have to be resolved. And so until these become a real priority for both countries, we're not going to make progress.
I'm getting more and more pessimistic about the prospect because previously we may have a engagement, and later on we have the dialogue of SED, of GCCT. President Xi in Mar-a-Lago with President Trump set up the 4 platforms on the key major issues for a scheduled dialogue, but right now there's no other official channels or platforms that are really sanctioned for both sides to really engage or dialogue. Right now, the silver lining is that, okay, we still have the contact, but we do not have any mechanism to really to engage in discussion. So principles are important to set the stage. Between two presidents, between Liu He and senior officials from the United States, but operational side, we do not see substantial progress. The tariff is still there, and now there's an increasing effort on the entity list, and there's a boycott against the Winter Olympic, and also there's a condemnation over the Chinese practices on humanity and and they also promote the United Nations to take some action, so et cetera, et cetera. So it seems that the relationship is really continuing to move downhill.
Yeah. I don't want to sound politically naive, but usually journalists are. How important it is, gentlemen, looking from even outside, that we don't take these kind of lists as common practice, as a matter of fact, but rather be able to work on solutions. Or are we gonna, as a whole, lay back and say, I can't do anything. And therefore, things will build up, vicious cycle, going nowhere, which is gonna hurt everybody. We know that. When the two elephants in the world fight, all the grasses and the two elephants are gonna be hurt as well. So what are we seeing now?
Well, what I think is that the big issues are not resolved, and the entity list and other things that are impacting business are basically the collateral damage that occurs because we're not able to resolve the bigger issues. So I would hope that we resolve those bigger issues, because then we can actually spend more time on these important business issues. But I feel from the United States that these business issues are not the top priority for either administration right now. And I hope that changes soon, because we have much to lose if we don't change our strategy.
It seems that Washington has really been retreating from the continued engagement, and based on their assumption that it is very difficult, if possible, to change China. So therefore, they get more on the defense side, and then on the other side, on the containment side. They also cite a number of even conflicting justifications for such sort of action, on human rights issues, on the technological competition issues, on the market distortion issues, etc. So the problem is that if you cite too many reasons simply to serve one direction, that is really continued decoupling. And that can also confuse the entire climate, because businesses, they do not know, in which way they want to move and satisfy which criteria. And then different, institutions, in order to please the constituencies, and and also on the other side, to compromise with their bosses. So they are also at loss. So this is a very sad situation. But strategically, of course, businesses will have to find their own creative way to penetrate such sort of iron curtain. I mean, this is not really political iron curtain, but some sort of institutional iron curtain, and continue to work together.
It seems that it's still very important to make sure that we understand the logic of things and not being lost by actions. Thank you so much for both of you. Anthony Chen, Liu Baocheng, really appreciate it.